Hello, everybody. My name's Owen Graffam. I'm the Assistant Director of the Environment and Society Programme here at Chatham House. And yes, here we are in the snow, which I think makes it a very good day to talk about sustainable infrastructure. So many thanks to those of you who braved the weather to come and be with us in person here. And also thank you to all of those online who are dialing in from their lovely warm homes and yes, probably having a lovely time there. The discussion today is going to examine how construction design and infrastructure strategies should evolve to deliver on sustainability goals, remain competitive and maximize societal outcomes. We have a lovely group of speakers with us, two here, two online, and I'll introduce them in a second. But first, some housekeeping. This session is entitled Built for Net Zero. It's supported by EY. We are recording this session and it will be available on the Chatham House website afterwards. I do encourage you to tweet because apparently this event is on the record. It's not under the Chatham House rule, so please do tweet using the hashtag #CHEvents. And if you want to ask a question here in the audience, then please raise your real hand. And if you are online, please raise that funny virtual hand. And I'll try and juggle those two things as we're going throughout the discussion. I guess, yeah, I may call on those who are online to unmute in order to ask your questions, but let's see how that goes. If it's going very poorly, then I'll stop doing that. Anyway, so where are we overall? Where do we sit? Well, we've just come out of the Sharm el-Sheikh climate COP, where it's been reiterated that as an international community, we're still falling far short of our Paris goals, with no real credible pathway to that 1.5 degrees. Policies currently in place point to a 2.8 degree temperature rise by the end of the century, and implementation of current NDCs will only reduce this to kind of 2.4, 2.6 degrees. So ambition needs to be ratcheted up across all sectors. We know, for example, in the buildings and construction sector that around 37% of CO2 emissions and 34% of final energy demand come from buildings and construction. And we know in Europe that we need to retrofit on the order of 15,000 housing units every day for the next 30 years. So how do we do this in ways that are genuinely sustainable? And this, of course, isn't just a buildings challenge, this is an infrastructure session. So as the impact of the war grips, it's not just going to be the winter of 2022 that creates problems, and there will be problems in 2022. But you know, if we're thinking out to 2023 and the winter of 2023, it's looking even more challenging. So do we have the energy infrastructure that we need to cope with significantly less oil and gas from Russia? Are we able to take the political decisions that give us a modern and green infrastructure across transport and industrial sectors? These are the type of questions I'm challenging our panelists to answer. It's not all doom and gloom. So sustainable infrastructure was on the menu at Sharm. 88 countries already included buildings in their NDC commitments. France and Morocco leading us off in a kind of buildings breakthrough agenda. There are things happening. Solutions exist. And I want to cover some of those range of things. So technology, design, public policy, financial tools, business strategies. Again, these are some of the things that I hope we can tackle today. So with all that said, I'm going to pass over to this much more knowledgeable panel than me to give us the answers. And first, I'm going to call on Saya. So Saya is the business and consulting leader at EY in the UK and Ireland. And yes, please kick us off, Saya. Looking forward to hearing your remarks.
I heard France and Morocco there, and I thought for a moment we were going to talk about the football.
Well, yeah, I was.
Maybe there's a whole sustainability conversation over there as well, but I'm going to try not to go there. I'm not going to predict the World Cup results. Look, I think there's a few points I'm going to try and make quickly. I think the first one, look, we're all here because climate change is a defining topic of our time. And I think there is the key, collaboration and long-term thinking is absolutely key to solving complex problems such as climate change. But I do want to stress that I really believe that the role of government is absolutely critical here. I say that because, some of the challenges that you've just spoken about, Owen, we're in a situation where we're sort of asking people to choose between heating their homes in order to survive the winter and making a shift to and kind of being part of paying for the energy transition. And I don't think that is the right question to be asking citizens. I actually think that this is a role of government to really be able to strike the balance between focusing on the kind of current energy supply and cost of living issues, but really retaining long-term thinking around the sustainable solutions that will bring us closer to net zero. And the challenge with that, obviously, is the level of investment that's required is quite significant. And Nelson might talk a little bit about the 7 trillion number that that many people might be familiar with. But I don't think money in itself is the issue, and actually that investment can drive a lot of other societal outcomes. We've done some work with the Global Infrastructure Hub, which is a G20 initiative, and looking at actually where some of that money can be invested. And when you look at the different subsectors, so you look at transport, actually what you're also enabling is access to economic outcomes. You're also enabling job creation. You're also enabling kind of social mobility, as well as that low carbon transition. I think when you're looking at investing in social infrastructure, you're getting kind of access to jobs and services. An investment in energy, it also has societal value, because aside from the decarbonization, you're also doing job creation. So I think the role of government's actually much more about deciding where to place the money, but not losing sight of that longer term thinking and the sort of the broader societal benefits. I do think we need a mindset shift in the industry, is perhaps my final point. And for me, that means moving away from kind of greening poor design and rethinking actually outcomes to start with. So if I think about like transport, for example, the network load and congestion is not going to be solved by the fuel shift. So there's something about that point about sustainable infrastructure, which kind of needs a different way of thinking. And it is more about thinking the resilience and the use of the network as well. I mentioned about using kind of investment to create jobs and industries, again, coming back to sort of the government investment. Like you look at Denmark, for example, significant advancement in wind and offshore, in wind energy, that initiates and starts with government investment. We have an opportunity, I think, in the UK, if we focus where we are today, to really use the investment that we make in major infrastructure to create new skills and new industries. And I think fundamentally there is a bit of a mindset shift, which is about building only when necessary. And maybe that's, of course, in some of the fuel shift requires building, but there is a bit of, there is no such thing as a fully green build until, unless we use the investment to invest in those kind of new construction methods and new materials. So my opening thoughts, I'm sure we'll go into more detail on that.
We will. Thank you, Saya. That's brilliant. I'm going to keep the momentum going, and I'm going to go through our 4 speakers first, and then we'll start a bit of a moderated conversation after that. So no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ben Wilson, who's the Chief Strategy and External Affairs Officer at National Grid. Over to you, Ben.
Owen, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to join. So National Grid, we're a networks company, primarily electric. We're about 70% electric networks and about 30% still gas networks. And we're UK-US around 50-50. And I'm joining today from Boston and Massachusetts, which is one of our network areas. One of the world's largest investor-owned utilities, and we're very committed to a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway to net zero. I think one of the first observations I'll make, and I will focus mainly on energy infrastructure, given my role and what National Grid does, is in many ways 2022 is a year we made a significant step beyond the energy trilemma. So traditionally, we talk about an energy trilemma. We talk about the need to decarbonize, But we talk about balancing that with affordability and reliability, because historically renewables have been expensive, and because solar and wind are intermittent, they've been seen to pose challenges for reliability. But what I would say now is that it is clear that renewables are now the lowest cost form of new entry power generation. And in particular in Europe at the moment, given the impact of Putin's war and the weaponization of energy, not just by a little, but by a lot, right? Offshore wind is now multiples cheaper than gas-fired generation, for example. And on the reliability side, renewables generally are domestic. And if they reduce our reliance on imported gas and therefore exposure, even if indirectly, to Russian gas, then they help with security of supply too. So I would say now we're moving beyond the energy trilemma. And that is true perhaps to a lesser extent, but also in the US as well, where we've seen high prices. Areas like Massachusetts are reliant on gas imports. And we have developments like the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is clearly as much about jobs and growth and national security as it is about climate change. The scale of investment required is absolutely enormous, and I'm sure that'll be a feature of this panel discussion. And for every dollar that we need to spend on renewables, we need to spend a comparable amount of money, maybe a bit less, but comparable amount of money on networks. And if you take the UK, to state the obvious, offshore wind, there are no customers in the North Sea. So it doesn't do much good without lots of network capacity to bring that power essentially down to the southeast of England. And in the case of National Grid, our capex plan is £40 billion over the next 5 years, of which about £16 billion is in the UK, and £40 billion is very close to £1 million an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, investing in the energy transition. If we do that, that has the prospect of reducing energy prices in the UK. If we can get, say, halfway back to where prices were before the current crisis in the UK, that could take hundreds of pounds a year off the end customer's bill, as well as decarbonising and increasing reliability. In order to do that, there's a few things required, and I'm sure we'll touch on them in this discussion. Regulatory reform to allow us to invest ahead of need rather than waiting until the connection request comes. That's very, very important, because we'll never invest at the pace unless we can invest ahead of need. Planning reform to shorten the timescale for us to build new projects. It can take the best part of a decade currently. The ability to invest more in local communities that are hosting infrastructure. That's very important. The ability to work with the supply chain on a strategic basis. And also innovations in design of new infrastructure. So an enormous amount to do. It is achievable, but those non-price drivers are very important to allow us to make that build out, get prices down, and get more secure as well as lower carbon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, very, very useful, and yes, the first of a series of big numbers that I think are going to hit us tonight. I'm going to turn now to Christina. So Christina Gambaya, she's the CEO of the World Green Buildings Council. Yeah, please go ahead, Christina.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you for this conversation. I'm learning a lot already from what I've heard from the previous two panelists. I have the privilege of leading a global network of green building councils that are in 77 countries. So there's 77 NGOs that are aligned towards a progressive vision of advancing whole life carbon thinking solutions, advancing circularity, advancing social equity, and regeneration as possible, of course, because now we have also a biodiversity crisis alongside the climate change crisis. So we're in the business of how does good like? What does good like? Those NGOs convene stakeholders around the value chain, because construction infrastructure has a lot of stakeholders, a big value chain, and usually as the solution doesn't reside in one actor. So that's the problem we have here. We have an integration issue here of different languages and expertise, even in with this panel. So we've at World GBC, we just came. I spent 2 weeks at COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, and we hosted over with a coalition coalition of NGOs calling the Building to COP Coalition, over 200 events on the built environment. And we talked about solutions relevant for developing countries and developed countries, but they're one and the same eventually. Solutions are different, but it's around what we're talking. What does good like? And so we were prioritizing issues like energy efficiency, embodied carbon, adaptation, resilience, right? Climate change is here. We need to help people to adapt now, and nature-based solutions, which is the greener side of infrastructure possibly. So the question we also have here and we're sharing is, how do we meet this demand? The demand comes from the world still is urbanizing at a very high rate in the developing world. And we are going to see massive growth in infrastructure, which if it's not done properly, there's not going to be enough resources in the world to meet that demand. There's not going to be enough energy to go there. And in the developed world, we have here a problem of retrofitting and understanding a holistic solution of the problem of use, if you like. So in another conversation and to simplify what I'm talking about, is that I agree we're at the moment where we have to question the why we do things. Infrastructure comes at a point where it is needed for quality of life, but it shouldn't be done without holistic or systems thinking or community-based prioritization. Because if not, we're going to run into trouble, which is already happening. If the solutions are siloed in the developing world, growth will go into biodiversity hotspots, nature will continue to shrink, and we won't have let's say, safe environments for us to thrive as a civilization. So I was saying, what are we about in another language? There's not enough resources. We need to reduce demand for energy. We're wasteful in the resources we're using right now, going into all solutions. And the energy efficiency, the efficiency solution, the circularity has to be top of mind. Right now, only 8% of the world or solutions are circular, meaning we have lineal systems, and governments still promote just cost-effective solutions short-term without thinking what does good like in a life cycle. Infrastructure decisions made today will stick with us around 50, 80, 100 years. So we're still designing today. The webinar is net zero. We're not designing for zero today. So how are we going to achieve having emissions by 2030? We're off track. Buildings emissions grew 5% last year. And the rest of the infrastructure sector is very close to being called off, a very high emitting and polluting sector, unless we have wider collaborations and get our act together.
Thanks, Christina. I'm really glad you brought kind of energy efficiency to the fore. I think it's something that should be at the center of our discussion tonight. I was looking at a slide from Amory Lovins just yesterday, which showed kind of the emissions we'd saved since 1975 based on our energy efficiency, massively outpacing the emissions saved from renewable generation. It's just kind of striking for us to keep in mind, I think. Okay, last but not least, Dr. Nelson Ogun-Shakin, who's the CEO of the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, FIDIC. And Nelson, I'm sure we want some big numbers from you, and yeah, looking forward to that and the rest of your presentation.
Thank you very much, Owen. Thank you for inviting me to join you, Chatham House, for this particular session. The subject is very topical, as you correctly said, Owen. I think it might probably be helpful if I give you an insight to who we are, and then that will back up into the rationale for the big figure and where we're coming from. I mean, FIDIC represents over 40,000 companies around the world, all in the professional services sector, involved with design, building, and maintaining and operating, infrastructure assets. And it goes through the whole life cycle of that. With 40,000 companies, over 100 countries that we represent, is huge in terms of the footprint that we have. And as our member does, they get involved with the whole project life cycle. So we are really at the key point in having major influence on what is being discussed. I mean, of course, to go straight into the point, we're talking about build for net zero. My view on it is that the time is now to deliver on this agenda. There is no time to lose. And the engineering and construction sector is pivotal in the world in achieving net zero. We will not forgive ourselves If we get it wrong, as most of my colleagues already said, we're already running late on the target. So that's important. Yes, politicians do need to step up. We do believe they need to step up. And really, we also need to get the client to step up. There is no big social, gain or losses for any individual, but actually the significant gains here is really job creation and opportunity to boost the economy, as we know. And we've gone through the whole issue of, 7 billion. Where does the 7 billion come from? Well, if you go through the OECD, they did suggest about 5.6 billion trillion that was required to be built and to be invested over if we're going to achieve the 2030 to 2050 agenda. But with the COVID, the world stopped for nearly 2.5 years. And then we had the shock of the supply chain. And then we have the ultimate goal, the big elephant in the room, Ukraine. So the whole three events that's happened back to back, in our estimate shows that it is in 5-point-something trillion we're looking at. It is close to 7 trillion we need to spend for us to even dream to catch up. And that report, if you do have a look at the report, we're talking about net zero, but also we're also talking about the need to deliver that net zero. So there's the other concept we came up with, which is net resources. If we don't have the resources to divine and to design and to build, then we have a real major problem. So in my view, I think we need to keep our focus on the price, despite the challenges and the economic constraint. We are an industry where we can build ourselves out of issue, but I think, we need to think, rethink the way we do things. The world has been, slow to react to climate change. And we in FIDIC, not only do we produce the report on state of the world and talk about 7 trillion, but we also produce a charter which really covered roadmap across the whole of the supply chain. From our point of view, from us as an organization, what do we need to do to make sure we are working towards net zero? What does our members need to do to work towards net zero in terms of their own behavior and the culture they need to understand? How do we need to apply this principle across, to achieve net zero through the build cycle? How do we apply the principle across in the maintenance side of the asset? And how do we look beyond that point in terms of the resources we require to move forward? So in my view, I think, the whole of our industry need to work together. I hear the word collaboration, absolutely important. And also, we need to call out those who are not playing ball. It is important. Some are paying lip service to the whole idea. And we cannot ignore the role of investor. Neither can we ignore the role of the funders or even the multilateral development bank, who need to look at different mechanics and different financing strategy in terms of, how to make projects sustainable. If I look at it from the point of view of what I do as the chair of the investment committee, there are things that we need to look at in terms of the ESG metrics. And we look at that, we make a decision whether we've ticked all the boxes, but is that the only solution? Could we do more? So my view on it is we are all in together, and there may be a need for us to actually start to actually price carbon, and that we need to get to a point where we look at the whole life cycle of any particular project and create what I call carbon balance sheet, to understand exactly what carbon emission before we even touch the ground, at the point where we start to look at touching the ground, to the point where we construct. And when we do construct, we also need to look at the operation of the asset to look at what carbon is being emitted or being mitigated. And the combination of that multiplied by the price of the carbon allows us to start to create carbon balance sheet, which is a new philosophy we're trying to look at. So in short, I think we are all in together. We are not doing enough. And we all need to work together to make sure at least we achieve that. I do believe strongly that the consulting industry who cut across the whole of the asset life cycle have a key role to play. And I do share the same view as my colleague who spoke earlier on. Yeah, 7 trillion sounds like a lot of money, but actually we are struggling to burn that. And I think we need to have a different philosophy on how the investor need to think and the politician, how they need to act in the way they operate, because, waiting for the cycle of the political timeline is not the best that can help us to achieve the goal. So my take on it, we are all in together. We need to work together, and we need to make sure at least we have the right policy and the right process in place to measure carbon, to be able to put value to it. Thank you very much, Owen.
Thank you, Nelson. And since we are talking about the money and the finances, I mean, maybe a good place to start is to ask all of the panelists here to what extent they think this is about money. To what extent is this a financial challenge of raising the 7 trillion that we need? I don't know who wants to kick us off. Maybe I'll pick on someone. Christina, do you want to have a first go?
I would like a clarification first, because the 7 trillion is on all physical assets, including buildings, Nelson?
Oh,
Oops, sorry. got
Sorry,
you.
can you, no, good question, good question. The view was that was purely what I call on the hard infrastructure. I tend to take infrastructure in 2 dimensions. One is I call social infrastructure, which is building, property, hospital, education. Then there is the economic infrastructure, which deals with the road, the rail, the airport, and that was really predominantly on the economic infrastructure. I believe that, if you are to add the, sort of social infrastructure to it, the figure will be much bigger than that.
Totally. Yeah, so I think,
Sorry, does that surprise you?
no, that's good. No, then I'm qualifying what would be the answer on the 7 trillion. Because let's say as citizens, we need to have a proper access to quality of life. Infrastructure is pretty much our response for assets for us to be able to thrive, right? Including housing, which is our basic comfort. Humans are a very weak species. We were already complaining about a little bit of cold and we're already out of our comfort zone. So homes, connections, productivity. It means productivity, it means opportunity, it means growth. But infrastructure can be part of that clean growth transition. So the resources are there. What I'm not seeing is our collective response in a wider infrastructure segment. For buildings, there are rating tools, they're performance-based, there's whole life cycle assessments on products. There's now different ways to go about it. Procurement, electrifying buildings, bringing in renewables, energy efficiency first. The principles for net zero are there. But when we go into a community space, what does that look like? How do we make investors understand what are they funding? Because it's not a problem. We need the resource and we need the investment as a society. But how are we making clear what's the hierarchy of those investments from a wider space? What does success look like? So I think now we're in agreement that it's low carbon, a high quality of life, right? That brings prosperity. And how do we ensure that we get the right, let's say, policy signals to enable the private sector to do the right investments? There's still some announcements in different directions that the direction of travel for businesses is not right. It's not clear. However, I do want to say it's investment in sustainability is the investment to future-proof any any assets, because you will be having stranded assets not fit for purpose if they are polluting, high carbon and intensive. Eventually, we will catch up with the transparency that is asked upon us, and then we will see the financial sector more clearly driving the investments where they go, instead of us saying, do we need it or not?
Okay, thanks, Christina. Ben, maybe I could turn to you. I mean, you raised the scale of the challenge for the national grid in terms of raising that finance. How big an issue is the money for you?
Yeah, thanks, Owen. I think utilities generally have strong balance sheets, good credit ratings. So I think generally we can raise the money as long as the regulatory regime is supportive and clear. And the rate-based model in the US, the regulated asset-based model in the UK, I think is a great model for network infrastructure, highly investable. The contracts for difference model in place for new renewables, again, is highly investable. So I think on the network side of the meter, if you like, I think it is really around regulation and policy. If you get the right regulation framework in place, the private sector will deliver the capital, no problem at all. On the other side of the meter, and here thinking particularly about decarbonising transport and heat, I think it is a little different. On the transport side, I think we are now probably beyond a tipping point in the UK and getting close to it in the US for take-up of electric vehicles. Charging infrastructure is now probably what is lagging. And so more focus and effort around mobilizing capital to invest in charging infrastructure, I think, is important. But the really difficult one is decarbonising heat in buildings, both residential buildings and commercial buildings. The scale of heat in energy terms is very large, and the dependency on gas, for example, is very embedded. At network scale, we can do it. I do think a second vector, so I do think green hydrogen and other renewable gases would be a very good thing to develop. On the customer side, redoing your own home in order to move to either an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump, it may save you money once you've done it, but the capital cost up front to do it is quite significant. And I think you mentioned in your opening remarks the number of homes we need to convert a year. I don't think as a society we have the answer yet as to how those individual household expenditures are going to be financed. So I think more effort is required in that area.
Okay, and maybe Saya, I might just ask you to come in there, because you mentioned the kind of onus on consumers to kind of change their own behaviours, and Ben's picked up on that point as well. I guess just wondering.
Ben's points around kind of the challenger and the capital around the networks and stuff like that, absolutely is there. I think there's a sort of, as I said in my opening part, I think there's a flaw in kind of assuming that people can pay for these things. And for me, that is what's holding us back, because if you're basing it on an individual ability to pay for this at a time when cost of living and everything else, and we're not making progress on something that actually is quite existential. Now, I'm not saying that as kind of citizens we don't have any responsibility, but I think our responsibility comes in sort of how we vote and what policies kind of we support, rather than thinking that we all have to sort of pay for our own sort of our own personal transition. I think that there's a point perhaps around money that is worth also reflecting on, which is cost, and the cost of and sort of the impact of investing in technology versus investing in commodities. Because you look at when it comes to a lot of the sort of renewables and clean energies, they benefit from the same sort of exponential curves as any other technology. A solar panel was like $100 a unit in 1975. It's sort of 20 cents a unit today. Wind costs sort of 30 times decline in 40 years. Batteries 40 times decline in 30 years. So I think that is one of the benefits that sometimes gets lost around the fact that actually the cost of these things and their efficiency is going down. And so the return on it is really quite positive when you're investing in technology. Perhaps might only add to Ben's points.
No, thank you. Listen, I'm gonna abuse my position as chair to ask one more little round of questions, but then after that, I'd like you to all get thinking of yours, and we'll start the kind of audience participation section of this. I guess where should I start? I guess in the UK here, there's been a lot in the media recently about the Cumbrian coal mine. There's been a lot about UK North Sea oil and gas. I guess my question to the panel is really if they think that these types of investments will ever fall into the bucket of sustainable infrastructure. I'm kind of leaving that one out there for you. I don't know, Nelson, do you want to start off there?
Yeah, thanks very much, Owen. Just to pick up on the comment that was said earlier on, I don't want to spend too much time on it. I think when you look at the population of the world at the moment, we are 8 billion, and it's forecast to be about 9.7 billion by 2050. And you find that the bulk of that is going to be in sub-Saharan Africa. Then the issue about finance is actually quite important about how we can actually achieve this issue. So I think the cost of the finance implication is very important, and really policy, as Ben said, regulatory environment is very critical to unlock. But to answer your second question, which is really about decision, I mean, the issue about coal and going more extraction coal, it doesn't go down very well, let's be honest, as the right thing for us to be doing. But if we are going to do that, there is an opportunity for carbon capturing to be put in. This technology are already tried and tested. And therefore, if we are complementing such a decision with the use of carbon capturing, then it isn't a big issue. But if we are doing it in isolation, and we're not thinking about this idea of carbon capture where we can store the carbon that come out of it, then I think we are sending wrong messages to the market. And the other one that you talk about is about issue about North Sea. Of course, it's what we have. And there will be gas. Gas will be part of the energy transition. We're not going to be making that move overnight. The question is, are we better off to actually bring it from UK or bringing it from overseas? And if we are going to do that, how can we do it in such a way that we see it as an interim measure rather than a final decision? Because really, in going into the renewable, we need to start to invest at the right time. And if we don't invest at the right time, bring the cost of production down and increase the productivity, then we have a challenge that we may be in a difficult period to actually achieve our goal. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. Who wants to come in on that one next? Either of you two?
I can do, because Christina's given me the side eye. I think you can go next. Oh God, it's in a way, I'm sort of glad I'm not a government minister, right? Because you can sit here and make comments, and obviously it's you have some very difficult decisions to make in balancing cost of energy, sort of security of energy, and everything else. But as Nelson says, of course, it's really difficult to sit here and sort of defend those types of decisions, because they are in the end more short term than long term. We are not with those decisions investing in creation of kind of new skills, new technology, new sectors and industries that are about kind of the next 50 years. We are solving problems of today. It's probably all I can say about that. To be honest, that's Christina.
And I wonder about the communities that are going to be invited to have those jobs around the coal mine. Their health, their well-being, the exploitation of coal. We're talking about in the UN process about phasing it out, asking other countries to follow suit, coalitions of countries trying to clean up the systems. And yes, we're empathic with the short-term thinking. However, it's not only about just bringing one more fuel, it's about systems thinking. And you raised it well in terms of, yes, the better to have natural gas, domestic if you like, but then there should be a proportionate response, about a comprehensive response of renovating badly insulated buildings first, electrifying buildings, electrification, and making sure that there's a program for people to acquire and renovate heat pumps, install heat pumps, and use renewable energy. As you were saying, renewable energy is a technology. The other are commodities. It's just 20th century solution for an opportunity for our economies to create prosperity that is not doing away with the planet. It's just, I don't understand.
Thanks, Christina. Ben, do you want the last word? And then I will open up to the audience here.
Yeah, thank you. When we think about energy, unabated fossil fuels, so coal or gas generation, clearly is not sustainable in the long term. So if we do any of it, it has to be clearly consistent with a credible pathway towards net zero. That's where we need to get to. That coal mine is not for energy; it's metallurgical coal. So it's outside of our focus area. On the gas side, right now, I checked just before the panel started, about more than 50% of power generation in the UK right now is coming from gas, right? So we have a long way to go. We need to stick to that pathway, get it down as fast as possible. But within that envelope, if we are going to have gas, it's better that it's domestic gas than imported gas. That's more secure. It's also lower emissions.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, so this is where I open up to you guys. So please put up your hands. We've got questions coming in on the online audience, but I'll start at the back here with this gentleman. If you could introduce yourself when you ask your question, please.
Hi there, my name is Shabanga, and I'm from the FS side of EY. And I wanted to ask, what role does the panel think financial institutions have on the transition to net zero? Because often construction and infrastructure projects need to be financed and also importantly insured as well, and they have a big role in, perhaps divesting from carbon-intensive construction projects, but we're not seeing that at the moment. So what role do they have, and is there a way for us to convince them to perhaps transition to more sustainable infrastructure?
Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple, and then we can go around the group. One here.
I'm a research analyst from Wood Mackenzie. So my question is more about the global competition. So for example, now in Europe, we think batteries are very important for the electric vehicles and energy storage. However, now for the US government, they provide more incentives. And also in Europe, currently, because of the cost of the energy, and some of the European battery plants, they are thinking about move to the US. So what is your view on this?
Okay, thank you. We'll start with those two questions then, and I'll come back and take some more, including from some of the online audience. Who wants to jump in here? Christina? Yeah.
There's a lot of financial innovation around promoting sustainable buildings. So from green mortgages, right? Banks can provide a less interest rate, more loans if the housing qualifies to standards that promote high energy efficiency, high quality, air quality, holistic solution to a good home. There's that. There's also let's say the opportunity to also link into sustainability linked loans. That's happening more and more often. So companies are linking getting a loan to their performance towards their science-based target or their 2030 decarbonization goals. We see it through World GPC's net zero carbon buildings commitment signatories. So they have those financial innovations that keeps them transparent, and with that transparency and disclosure, the financial sector can also let's say, give them a reward for that. It's not every practice in the financial sector should be this. I hope it's scaled up and mainstream. Those sorts of innovations are the ones that we need for us as consumers also to understand better what are we funding to.
Thank you. Others? Any signal from Nelson or Ben that they want to come in on these?
Can I come in, please, on the finance
Nelson.
investor side? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, please, Nelson, go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
It's funny, I mean, that I sit within TFL as the deputy chair for what I call Program and Investment Committee, and we go through a very stringent, compliance process on all our investments, and whether it's renewal of our existing assets or looking at, new build. And so it's very important. But I think in terms of the overall concept, it's worth mentioning that a lot of investors now are looking for ethical investment, and they are genuine about ethical investment. They're looking for green, sustainable infrastructure, and they make a condition of the ESG as a priority before they actually, venture into drawdown. So I think a lot of investors are very much looking into this here. The pension fund who are looking to go into what I call long-term asset ownership, they're really keen about understanding the whole process of, how do you decarbonize the existing asset, or even building out, carbon out of the new development. So I think, a lot of investors are now looking in a very sophisticated area. What I do believe that is missing out is the whole idea of how do you measure, carbon throughout the whole of the project life cycle. And that's why in FIDIC, we are now developing this concept of what I call the carbon balance sheet, to look at a particular project throughout the whole life cycle and to measure the carbon emission or what will be mitigated out of it and be able to put a price on that. I think if we get to that stage where we can put a price on carbon, then it makes life much easier for investors to say, what is it that I'm acquiring having completed the building itself? Because a lot of investors are looking at post-construction acquisition of the asset. I'll give you a classic example. On the so-called, Crossrail, which is now Elizabeth Line, we built that particular project. It was very, very considered. Digital twin was applied in the whole process. We look at the carbon emission, and then investor came and acquired the rolling stock on the basis that they know this is an ethical investment and it addresses the issue of carbon. So I think investors are looking more sophisticated than ever before. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. And Ben, maybe you could come in on the kind of battery question that came up.
Yeah, sure. If I understood the question right from Wood Mackenzie, it was around the significance of the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the support that the US is putting behind, new technology. I do think it is seminal. I do think it's very, very significant. And I think, in particular, to pick one sector, I think it will be an absolute game changer for hydrogen. In particular for green hydrogen, and we see a lot of focus moving to the US. And I think it is an example of the comment I made earlier around we're moving beyond the trilemma, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act is about emissions reductions, but it's also about jobs and growth, and it's also about national security for the United States in terms of making sure that supply chains are onshore and so on. So it really shows the end of the trilemma. I suspect we'll see policy response in Europe providing similar support. And I would very much like to see the UK also, think strategically around some of these sectors. And certainly, we see those signs coming from BEIS, in particular around hydrogen. I think it's very, very important. The IRA Act is a game changer.
It's also a good example of the point about actually where government intervention can really actually create a real step change, isn't it, Ben? Like that, and that I think it's an example of that, because actually solving, moving to it's going to like long range storage as long it would be game changing. And so I think the other point just on the financial institutions, I think worth adding is maybe one stat for you is kind of the issuance of green bonds kind of exceeded $500 billion in 2021. I think that was something like a 75% increase on the year before. So there's definite, there's momentum there. Is it fast enough, or is most of the issuance comes from US, China, and Europe. There's something about how does it get, who benefits from it and the distribution of that, and needing to even that out. Particularly, Nelson, to your point about actually like thinking about the population shift towards the global south as well. But I would say I think there's definite movement and interest. It's just, moving it faster and distributing it appropriately.
Okay, thank you. I've got loads of questions online, so I'm going to try and cover a couple of them now. So first one from Murad Qureshi, who says, globally, the IEA has shown the Chinese lead on reducing costs of renewables like solar and wind, and their investment in renewables for many years. Is it them that will lead further via adapting their BRI initiatives in the emerging developing world? So, role of China in driving down renewable costs. And then we have one from Bali Kochar, who I'm going to paraphrase, but broadly the question is about how important is consistency of government policy in incentivizing moves towards, for example, energy efficiency in housing. So 2 questions. If we could have some quick responses, then we can get in another round from the audience. So who wants to go first? Maybe Christina, if you could kick us off.
Do you want me to jump in?
Yes, Nelson, go on. Yeah, please jump in. That's great.
I'll try and address the first one, the China one. I think, there is a challenge in the world at the moment that the biggest supplier of most of the solar panel that we need is actually from China. And then there is the issue about the ethical behavior that happens within that. Most of the multilateral development bodies are very, very concerned about this issue. Are they going to take a lead? I think they are actually leading the market. The question is, it goes back into what Syed was saying earlier on. I think if we can actually encourage more government intervention through looking at how can they bring the price and the cost of production down, you find that other countries will follow. But frankly speaking, right now, we are very much at the beck and call of the Chinese on this particular area, which I think when you look back on the issue of COVID now and the lockdown in China, the price is only going to do one thing, which is to go up. So really, I think if you look at what happened with the wind farm, when the whole system started, the blade was so expensive, limited number of supply, the price got up. But government intervention came through, the local production came through, and then you see changes coming through there. So I do believe this is where we need government policy, government intervention to make the cost of production cheaper. Thank you.
Thanks, Nelson. Any of our 2 on stage?
I mean, I think Nelson's point's well made. It's a bit like if you think about kind of supply constraints around chips from Taiwan, or any sort of extreme concentration of technology in one place comes with risk, right? Even if there's been enormous investment in there. I mean, so yes, and I suppose the other question around how important is the consistency of government policy vary. If that was a quick answer to your question, and I feel like I might be a broken record otherwise on that. But I think and consistency is critical in particularly when you also want that collaboration and response from the financial markets, because that is how you maintain that sort of investability in the assets and kind of continue to keep sort of the cost of financing down. And then the worst thing you can do is flip-flopping on policy from that perspective. If you want to add something.
Yeah, I was thinking as I heard you speak, of course, consistency from governments. Yeah, we need it. But I think just looking into what happened at COP28, the inconsistency of governments also in the leadership is quite evident. So I think in the infrastructure space, we need to continue to champion private sector leadership and those that are winning the clean energy transition race, and connect the infrastructure solutions to that sort of thinking, and then go back to government and show how conservative and old school they're being. We still in the infrastructure sector have a way to go. In some segments, productivity has been very low. McKinsey cost curves on productivity for infrastructure are the worst in many years. There's still people doing projects like they've done it 50, 60 years ago. So I think if we are ambitious in asking for the infrastructure sector to disclose their numbers, create data sets, and then go back to governments and ask them for better regulation, we'll have a better shot. And at World GBC, we're doing this. The Building Life project has delivered 10 national roadmaps for decarbonization of buildings, including the EU roadmap for decarbonization, bringing along hundreds of stakeholders. So business leading, saying private sector's got this, but we need some regulatory signals, and then let's go to facilitate the investments going where they are needed. If not, we'll get most of the same outcomes. And just because there's so many competing priorities, the private sector can show what good looks like to government and have the confidence that they can promote changes and it will still be good business sense. There's still, the green economy is the best solution if they promote it right.
Thanks, Christina. I'm going to come back to our audience again now. So if you have questions, raise your hand. If you don't, there's plenty online who are going to take your place. Let's go down here.
Thanks very much, Kirsty. Excuse me, Kirsty Hamilton, an associate fellow here. I'm also of relevance on the Scottish Government's Green Heat Finance Task Force, but I want to ask a question of my personal sort of frustration. As we're all in this audience energy consumers. Now, if any of us, I'd be slightly interested in a hands up, are trying to do anything involving retrofit on our own properties, I cannot imagine anyone is finding it easy. So what I'd be very interested in is what you think the primary obstructions are for scale rollout, including the role of the utility sector itself, because they have a primary relationship with us on energy, all of us as consumers. And yet I am left trying to make enormously complicated assessments of what needs to be done and not finding anyone to do it. And yet I'm not getting any help from my utility who prefers to sell me power. So I'd really be interested in, because we've known the retrofit problem for, at least well over 30 years, as you mentioned yourself, Owen, Amory Lovins, MAC curves, the whole lot. So anyway, love to hear what the answer is.
Thanks, Kirsty. And if I could just add a little addendum onto that question, we have one from Victor Katange online, which asks about whether skilled labour is a shortage. So maybe that's one of the obstructions that the panelists could address. Over here.
Yes. Thanks very much.
Ben, I'm just going to take a couple of questions from the audience and then I'll let everybody come in.
Yeah.
No problem.
Thank you. I'm Charles King-Tennyson. I'm at King's College London. I was just wondering what the panel's views would be on expanding nuclear power infrastructure. We've already talked a little bit about Cumbrian coal and North Sea oil, and the Green Party in Germany is currently getting rid of the last nuclear power plant there. But 15 years ago, nuclear power was almost the future. So, what's the panel's views? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll take one final one down here in front, and then I think we may have to rush through some answers, everybody.
Thank you. Alistair Ramage, I specialise in systemic change consulting. I find myself surprised to hear how much emphasis there is from the panel towards government action. Very strong theme. In working with a client recently, very interested in investing in green African infrastructure. Probably the biggest back pressure at the moment in that market is the high price of the dollar, which is a consequence of government action. So there's a little bit of kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul in all of this, some disingenuous incentives and similar. I wonder how we reset that so that the incentives align towards the outcomes we're actually seeking.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have 3 very good questions, 5 minutes, and 4 fired up panelists. And Ben, you're allowed to go first because your hand shot up as soon as the talk came of utilities.
Yeah, thank you. I'll address the retrofit question and the nuclear question and leave the other questions to other panelists. I very much agree, and I referred to it in my remarks earlier, that customer side challenge is the key one. Energy efficiency has been mentioned a number of times. It is the most important thing that we can do. I think, and we're working at the moment with Lloyds Bank and Octopus with the Prime Minister's Business Council on working with local councils to see if we can put in place schemes for retrofit. And we've got a pilot one up in Leeds, retrofitting social housing, which is quite interesting. I think the issue is one of upfront capital and then a question of trust. I think it's quite hard at the moment. It's not obvious if you say you've got a Victorian house which needs significant upgrading, where do you go to get information that you can trust about what the solution is? I think people find it very, very complicated to navigate. Utilities, I think, can have a role in this on the advice side, but I think actually bodies like local councils are very well trusted, and they may well be a good place to take a lead on that. And then I made comments earlier around the financing side. I think it's a big challenge. We are seeing a significant, if we unpack what's happening as we head into this winter, if we unpack it and weather correct it, we can see a significant price response already. So the incentive is there, given the high price of energy. It's not a question of incentives, it's a question of capital and trusted advice. On the nuclear side, I think, look, this energy transition to net zero is hard. Let's be realistic. Let's not underestimate the scale of the challenge. And I think we need as many tools in the toolbox as possible to do this. So absolutely, we would support new nuclear projects in the UK to have some solid baseload zero carbon generation to complement intermittent wind and solar. Also provides inertia and so on. I think is a very good thing to have.
Okay, thanks, Ben. We've got a hand up from Nelson. I mean, yeah, I'm sure there's many people who would want to come back, but we'll keep rattling through our panelists. Nelson, over to you.
Okay, very quickly. I mean, I think what is said by my colleague is very, very supportive of that. Just on the nuclear side, I think, yes, there is a need. And a few years back, it was something that you don't mention, but I think it's reality. Can we go for mini nuclear power station? Can we do it very quickly? Do we have the resources and the capacity? Do we have the guts, as a country to move in that area? I think it's a challenge, but I think it's something we need to look at into the energy mix. On the issue about retrofitting, I have a very strong view about what I think the government can do. And I know a lot of people are confused as to what is the right solution. I think it comes down to policy, and it comes down to creating the capability to be able to do what needs to be done. But also the ultimate is, if you invest this front man, how does this cascade down into the value of your property? And if we can address those 3 points, policy, the skill and the solution, and the ultimate value of that particular asset, then we start to make a positive move. Without that, then we continue to talk about it, nothing will happen. On the issue about systemic issue on Africa, you're absolutely right. A lot of the projects that I was involved with in West Africa, they are sort of gas-powered, project. And when you look at the cost of the equipment, it's all in dollars, and the local currency doesn't actually match that. So you have a gap. and all the time we look at the return on investment, it's not viable. So I think unless we can get to a point where you look at the project from the point of view what I call, sort of blended finance, to look at the front end of the project and have government support to get those projects to make it a bankable one. Otherwise, by the time you go through the whole project life cycle, you find that the whole project will not deliver the return on investment. So it comes down to the structuring of the deal and the local policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nelson. Christina.
Yes, there is something there about the systems layout, right? Where utilities are in the business, they're changing, right? But they sell more and more and more. And I said that we have a problem of waste, and the more and more, instead of the efficiency and how to get the incentives to help consumers to address the immediate urge to improve their leaky, wasteful houses. The building stock in the UK is the worst of the Europeans. I would say that to meet the Paris Agreement, we need 3% renovation rates across Europe. We're at 1%. In the UK, possibly not as good there. There's collaboration is the answer. Cities, there's a collaboration called Build Upon, also supported by the EU Commission in 30 cities, and local councils, as you were saying, also Ben, collaborating on the right data sets to understand greenhouse gas emissions, energy poverty, and job creation and the skills. And with that collaboration, we've understood also that the barriers are that sometimes national regulation doesn't help. And so going local and figuring it out, where are the pinch points that are not facilitating the process, working through innovations in finance. So there's some sort of either understanding the payback or getting us as consumers more confident that we are empowered to act to improve our homes. It's like there has to be a stronger campaign for people to have confidence that it can be done. Because right now there's silver linings here and there, but we don't have scale, and the problem is huge.
And I think the lack of scale comes the lack of skills. So even if you get it done, then the first time it breaks, you're going to spend 6 months trying to find someone to try and maintain it and fix it for you. But I think those problems have been solved by other countries. So I grew up in Sweden, which is why 2 centimeters of snow doesn't faze me when I need to get in today. But that's a place where actually this fine, the housing stock is in much higher quality, much better insulated in the first place. But that sort of retrofitting is also easier because there's the policies are in place, both in terms of the capital, but also in terms of the skills and the people who can come and do it. And I think I'll just make one last comment of nuclear. I'm sure you want to close us off, which is I'm with Ben on you need every tool in your arsenal to deal with this. So absolutely yes to nuclear. I think the question is for the communities that are hosting that type of infrastructure, whether it's nuclear or any other type of infrastructure. What's important is that we recognize that it is a community that is hosting that on behalf of all of us, and how do we look after that community as a consequence? I think that would be my comment to that.
Okay, so I'm aware we've ticked over our time limit, so I'm not going to continue to entertain you with lots of conclusion. I'll just say, I think we've heard a lot from our panelists today about money, about the scale of the challenge, of course, but we've heard so much more than that as well. That there have been talk about various different bits of tech. There's been talk about design strategies that can change the way we configure that investment need. Public policy has come up a lot. And yeah, maybe we can dig more into the financial tools and the business strategies that might change us as well. So with that said, I'm just going to say thank you to all of our panelists who've done a sterling job of entertaining us tonight. So a round of applause for them.